Thank you so much for the introduction. Hi, I'm Kate. I work for Mainsail Partners, but I won't dive into that just yet. First, I want to start with the thesis, which is that there are 4 main ways that product managers and product teams go wrong. And I'm going to claim that I've figured out what those 4 are. There are probably lots of subtypes, but at least these modes. And the way that I've figured that out is by working at Mainsail. We are a growth equity firm that invests mostly in bootstrap companies, all B2B software. We have 15 current portfolio software companies, but I've worked with more in my 3 years at Mainsail. And they span really the gamut in terms of types of B2B software. We have much more technical, more user-facing. We have stuff that's vertically focused, software for field service workers. We also have stuff that's much more horizontal, software for, very, very huge company treasury department management. All over the board in terms of price, a couple thousand in ARR on average per customer per year to a couple 100,000 in ARR per customer per year. And there are some tropes that sort of come through all of these companies. And those become the ways in which product managers can be partial. And in order to sort of think about what a partial product manager would be, we have to rewind and think about what a product manager would be. And there are lots of definitions for this. You could lean on things like Ben Horowitz's Good Product Manager, Bad Product Manager blog. I think a lot of people in here have probably seen that post. Be focused on the customer and the market. You could look to product thought leaders like Marty Kagan who thinking about delivering outcomes instead of delivering outputs. I agree with all of those things. The format I find most useful for the purposes of this talk comes from Martin Erickson of Mind the Product, which is this idea that product sits at the intersection of UX, business, and technology. And this maps pretty well to frameworks you might have used before around desirability, viability, feasibility. For the purposes of B2B products in particular, I like to split up the UX part into 2 pieces, the customer piece and the design piece. And the reason I like that, particularly for business products, is that the buyer, the customer that's making that buying decision, and the end user aren't always the same. There's definitely overlap, but you have to stay on top of both of those pieces, which is sort of an added degree of complexity and an additional ball that you could potentially drop. And I say this with humility because I think it's nearly impossible to be a well-rounded product manager all the time, or to build a product team that stays balanced and well-rounded continuously, because as you have new challenges come up or as you add new people to the team, it's natural to tilt to one side or the other. And so this is a constant balancing act, not a one-time fix. And as you end up at these incomplete intersections, you have different types of partial product managers. I'll go through them one at a time, starting with this one that I've dubbed a requirements writer. And so a requirements writer is really good at figuring out what the business thinks that it wants to build and what's technically required in order to build that. But they overlook customer needs, not just what the customer says that they want, but what the real underlying needs are, and all of the gritty work that goes into prying that back and figuring out not just what they say, but what they actually mean. And then thinking about designing something that's not just serviceable, that's not just meeting requirements, but actually enjoyable for customers and users to use. And the analogy that I find helpful for this one is sort of an overprotective parent. So this kid's parents. And everybody has met one of these people. They try to think way far ahead. They try to plan everything out. They're very constrained. It takes forever for them to go anywhere because they have to load everything into the minivan. The kid may or may not have as much fun as some of the other kids. And at the end of the day, there's always something that they couldn't have anticipated because kids and software products are unpredictable. And users, I guess. So what they do right is think ahead, but they end up over-constraining and leading to a less delightful experience. What this looks like in practice is that old waterfall model, where you start with what's the concept, and then what are the requirements, and then let's design it, and then let's develop it, and then let's launch it. And what this overlooks is all of that iterative customer and design thinking that can happen along the way. There's this one big effort up front, and that's sort of the end of it. And what that leads to is this tendency for product managers not to interact with customers, or if they do, not to do it recurringly. They do it once at the beginning, and then we've done our research, it's done, let's go build it. Or they don't create prototypes and test them with customers. They just gather, what do you need? Let me document it. I've got it all, let's go. They have maybe unexpectedly to them, maybe not unexpectedly to us, usage rates once everything is said and done, because they didn't test it along the way. They just sort of made a plan and then took a leap. And I think that this happens most frequently in companies that have sort of that history of on-prem, old-school software development just in their DNA. It also happens in regulated industries where that's been the norm for a long time. There is a lot of compliance stuff that you have to make sure to get right. But having good software is more than just checking all of the compliance boxes. In terms of fixing this problem, because one of the instructions I was given was that this conference should be actionable and useful immediately. So if you end up with this type of product team, what can you do about it? And the best thing I've found is sort of a huge injection of design thinking. And the best way I found to do that is to get everybody in a room and do a design sprint, which is this idea of taking a business problem, mapping it out, researching it, breaking it down, prototyping a solution, and testing it with customers in the span of a week. And there is this wonderful aha moment that can come with sort of old school teams when they realize that something like this is possible. A development cycle doesn't have to be months or quarters long. It can be really, really short. And this is a good way to give that boost to a team that hasn't ever done it before. The next type of partial product manager I've dubbed the deal chaser. So these guys are really good at thinking about what will customers buy. In fact, that's the only thing they think about. And that's really good for near-term business strategy. They do get revenue in the door, which is important for bootstrap companies like the ones that I work with. But they tend to overlook some other pieces of the job. One is, what's the overall design? This is a SaaS product that's meant to serve not just a couple of customers, but a whole market. How do we design such that the same product can do that? They also tend to overlook technical feasibility and scalability, and how do we build this in such a way that it's not going to be terribly buggy to maintain, because we have all of this little bespoke stuff that we've built for every customer along the way. They overlook that. And the analogy that I find most useful is youth soccer. So who's been to a youth soccer game? We're talking like 5, 6, 7-year-olds, little kids. So if yours are anything like the ones that I've been to, from kickoff, all of the kids swarm the ball. And they kick and they kick and they kick until the ball gets kicked loose, and then they swarm the ball. And they kick. And from the beginning of the game to the end whistle, it's just this cluster to cluster to cluster strategy. And no doubt, their coach has given them positions that they're supposed to stay in, and they have abandoned them. And their coach has given them some kind of strategy, and it is forgotten. The same thing can be true of teams, especially small ones. When they get so obsessed with the near-term goal, they are very goal-oriented, that they just cluster around it and forget that they can be much more strategic by staying sort of in their own predetermined focus areas. So what this looks like from a product team perspective is a lot of yes. A lot of saying yes to different internal loud stakeholders. Sure, we can add that, which then leads to a very long backlog. And a lot of custom stuff that gets worked into development, stuff written into contracts. And the result is that you have this really scattered strategy because you haven't stuck to a roadmap. You've just sort of gone from the loudest voice to loudest voice. This tends to happen, again, in sort of those bootstrap companies that need revenue in the door. It also happens in sales-led companies. So if anybody's ever worked for a company that was founded by somebody who came up through sales, or where sales is like a really vocal part of the leadership team. And I'm not dissing that kind of company. It's a very successful strategy. But it can lead to this if product doesn't have the backbone to sort of stand up and say, we're a product that's serving an entire, we want this product to serve an entire market. And strategically, what are the pieces that we want to take on to serve not just these couple of deals, but our entire target market? And that's harder the bigger the deal size, because there is this argument that you should get that in the door. And so you end up with an erratic roadmap. You end up with stuff that's promised into contracts that eats up development time for months and months to come. And you end up with a bunch of bespoke development that's harder to maintain. And so this one, actually, I know that there have been a couple of Penda talks. Penda's been really useful in this respect. One stat that I'll crib from them is that about 10% of features make up 80% of usage. Put another way, most of your customers don't use most of the stuff that you build. And that's especially true when you're building a bunch of bespoke stuff. So when you end up in a situation like that, where sales is asking for something for this deal, there are two good reasons to do it. One is this deal really is a monolith. This is game-changing. Whatever this customer wants, you should do it, because bringing them on board, they're just gigantic, or they're sort of industry-leading, and they're going to bring a lot of others with them. There probably are some deals like that. More often, what I see is that companies make the argument, well, we're going to build this for this customer, but lots of other customers are going to want it too. And the only way that you can prove that that's not the case is if you have good data to prove in advance, ideally, this customer, like, nobody's using any of the stuff that looks like this. We have reservations. Or at worst, to go back after the fact and say, we thought everybody would use this. It got next to no adoption after we spent, the bulk of our quarter working on it. Let's revisit the way that we approve these types of requests. So the next type of partial product manager I call super support. Super support is really good at responding to existing customers, even users within those customers. They're less good at thinking about strategic parts of the market that you're trying to get into next, new segments, new verticals, because they aren't hearing that stuff from existing customers. They're also less good at thinking about technical root cause problems. So they're hearing all of this negative feedback, and they're trying to fight it as fast as they can. But they get so busy doing that and trying to serve the customers that they don't think about root cause solutions that could stop sort of this cycle of issues and bugs. And for these, I have an old I Love Lucy sketch that I think is particularly funny. For anybody who hasn't seen this one, maybe a lot of people, the gist is that Lucy is working in a chocolate factory. And there's chocolate coming in on a conveyor belt. Her job is to wrap it, put it back on the conveyor belt for boxing and packaging. And the boss says, if any of this chocolate gets through unwrapped, you're fired. And so the chocolate's coming through, she's wrapping and placing, and then, of course, comically, the conveyor belt speeds up. And it gets to the point where she's shoving things in her mouth, in her shirt, in her hat, to prevent any of these chocolates from making it to the next room unwrapped. And that's exactly what happens when product takes on the super support mindset. They're just firefighting, and they're thinking about how do I squash all these bugs? How do I stop all these complaints? There's so many coming in. There's no time to think about anything else. And counterintuitively, that's exactly what you need to do, is think about why are there so many coming in. So what these product teams end up doing is they do a bunch of incremental ticket taking. They have a whole bunch of feedback coming in. They've got bugs, they've got support tickets, they've got sales requests, and they just put it all in this big backlog. I've worked with product teams where you ask about something, they're like, oh yeah, it's on the roadmap 2 years from now. Because it's just like, it's at the back of the line, and it'll make it there eventually in sort of sequential order. What they're not good at is thinking through the priorities of what are we really trying to accomplish, and how should this stuff stack rank based on those priorities. Or digging into the technology and why, particularly in a case where there are a lot of bugs, why are there so many? And how can we take a step back and prevent some of those rather than just squashing them one at a time? See this one in Bootstrap Companies too. Also see it a lot in companies that are founded by ex-operators of whatever the software serves. So if you built a company to solve your own need and you have a bunch of people that you've hired that are industry experts in that thing, they're sort of subject matter experts, they're really good at sort of empathizing with and helping customers solve their problems. They're less good and they're less used to building solutions that are meant to apply to a bunch of different customers and thinking about the best ways for one solution to serve a bunch of different needs and use cases. What happens is that long, detailed backlog, there are always highest priorities tend to be associated with individual existing customers rather than some segment of the market or the strategic priorities of the company. And the team rarely or never or very rarely just says, no, that's not a priority right now, which is a hard thing to do, but an important thing to do. Best solution here is Outcome-Based Roadmapping, a great book that came out this year, but certainly not the first. helps you think through how to align what you're building with why you're building it. There are lots of different ways to do that well, but ultimately any of them will help solve this problem of super support is focused on the what. What are all the things we need to do versus the why? And this helps cut through that noise. So the last type of partial product manager I call the idealistic inventor. This type of person is really good at building cool stuff. It seems like a really good idea. It's slick, it's scalable, it's well designed. The problem is that sometimes nobody wants to pay for it. And so they overlook what are the real customer needs, not what they want, what they need and are willing to pay for, and what are the type of things that will move our business forward. And the best analogy is sort of to think of a Rube Goldberg machine, which is really cool to watch. But at the end of the day, it's doing something really simple, which may or may not actually be a really valuable service to provide. I could put like a Juicero machine up here maybe, but don't want that documented. This product process starts with a, wouldn't it be cool if? And then you build it, and then you find out whether it actually works. And you skip over that sort of customer and business testing piece, where do customers really have a need here that they're willing to pay for? And is this something that I can build a business case around in the near term? This tends to happen most with tech-led companies as opposed to sales-led companies. And it tends to happen with funded companies because it's hard to continue with this for a really long time unless you have some money to sustain it. So we see less of this in the bootstrap world. And what happens is sometimes companies want to be in stealth mode. They don't want to talk to customers, usually a bad sign. They have discovery activities that lead the witness. So yes, they're doing something to try to test this with customers, but they're kind of just showing it off and saying, don't you think this is cool? Rather than trying things that would help get at, are you really willing to pay for this? If so, how soon? If so, how much? And then thinking about features that would be cool to build as opposed to problems that they're trying to solve. Best answer here is Business Experimentation. Another good book that came out this year goes through dozens of different business experiments. And my favorites are the ones that get at viability. So there are the desirability, there are the feasibility. The viability ones are really interesting. And that gets at, are you willing to prepay me for this thing? Are you willing to sign an LOI to buy this thing? And unsurprisingly, when people run these types of experiments, they get much higher rates of people who are willing to get more information or try it out, or even say verbally, yeah, we'd buy a ton of these. And then when it comes to actually signing even a non-legally binding piece of paper, that number shrinks massively to who would be willing to commit in any sense to financing this thing. So the real trick is to find the balance. And I think that that's an elusive thing. There's sort of this constant four-way teeter-totter that you're trying to centralize and stay on top of. I don't think that every product manager and every product team is guilty at some point in their career or the life cycle of their product of being partial. It's just how do you recognize and correct that when it happens. So to the extent that you end up being a requirements writer, over-constraining, doing too much up front, try to inject design thinking. Continue to test and iterate throughout your process. To the extent that you end up a deal chaser and you're moving from one thing to the next, take a step back to think about what are the longer-term priorities and measure what you're doing against, does this align with what our longer-term priorities are? If you end up in super support mode and things are coming at you way, way, way too fast, find the time to take a breath and think about why the issues are coming at you and why you're prioritizing the things that you are. And if you end up in idealistic inventor mode, think about how to test the stuff that you're building before it's completely done and do more business experiments along the way. Hopefully you can find your way to that ideal product manager somewhere in the middle and keep using a little bit of all of these in appropriate doses at appropriate times. So my name is Kate Hopkins. I blog about product management and B2B market strategy. Feel free to connect to me on LinkedIn, send me an email. This is the kind of stuff that I love talking about. Also, happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
What do you find is the most common partial product manager?
So I think it really depends on the company type. So at Bootstrap companies like the ones that we work with, I think that we find deal chasers and super support. But when I talk to people who are at funded companies, I think that you run much more into that idealistic inventor mode. And at older companies, you have much more of the requirements writer mode. So it depends upon what type of company you're at. Yeah.
You mentioned like kind of how what's really important is acknowledging or kind of correcting course when you realize that. What is the one tool or thing that we can do to actually practice acknowledging it? So that's kind of like the battle too. Is like knowing when you're going off course.
Yeah.
Off course. Is it like a IPM, or is it like, you know, some kind of monthly or quarterly activity or something like that?
That's a really good question. I think that there probably is some kind of self-diagnostic cadence that you could start and say, hey, here's some of these symptoms of these different problems. Are any of these true of us right now? And sort of force yourself and your team to recognize when you're going off course. Or ask somebody who's outside and has a little bit more perspective, sort of, where are we looking gappy? Or what questions would you be asking that we don't seem to be asking? I think it is probably hard. It's like the frog that's being boiled. Hard to notice that it's happening until it gets pretty extreme.
Quick question. So in the case of funded companies, where obviously the founders are passionate, technical, definitely in that idealistic inventor perspective, how can product managers who are usually in the weeds, who are implementing, right? How do we effect that change or bubble up some of these feedback? Because I think, yeah, that swing between negotiating or trying to convince.
Yeah.
I
think the most powerful thing you can do is put together sort of the different cases for how successful this thing could be. And so if we do this thing and it has this type of adoption and they pay this much, it would be really valuable. But I question that we're going to get this type of adoption or this type of price. And here's something I could do to test that assumption before we go and build it. I think that a founder would probably be really delighted to hear that kind of, I can do this cheap thing to test it before we spend all this money. And if we're right, fantastic. And if we're not, we'll change it sooner. Yeah.
I feel that deal chasing can sometimes be a symptom of like investor pressure, to get to the next, next round.
Yep.
Any suggestions for how founders can prevent themselves from being pigeonholed into becoming a deal chaser? And what kind of conversations should be had with investors in order to maybe convince them that that's not the ideal path?
Yeah. So I think the most powerful thing for helping, first, your question around investors pushing towards deal chasing definitely resonates. I've seen that happen. The thing that helps me reconcile that with more of a focused approach is thinking about the unit economics of all those deals that you're bringing in. And so almost certainly, if you've got this really scattered strategy and you're doing a healthcare deal today and a construction deal tomorrow and then a retail deal the next day, you're not leveraging sort of synergistic marketing efforts or building sales expertise, and that usually manifests in customer acquisition costs. It also tends to manifest in terms of cost of onboarding. And so how much does it cost you? You have to do a lot more hand-holding with a customer type that you've never onboarded before. And so usually you can make an argument that the unit economics of bringing these customers on board will be much better if you focus exclusively on healthcare customers. And you can build systems for making it really repeatably easy to bring on board healthcare customers. And you can do marketing efforts that will really saturate sort of the marketing piece of the market, the healthcare piece of the market in this particular scenario, and sales reps will be able to close deals in fewer days. And so it's a much more efficient way to grow. And so the question you're saying is, would you rather we grow more inefficiently or a little bit less more efficiently? And I think that's the conversation you have to force. Yeah.
Sorry, so I came in a little later, and I had, the other talk. But I had a general question that would love your feedback on. in cases where companies are fully vertically integrated, where there's hardware piece as well as software
yep.
piece, okay, you know where I'm going. Yeah, timelines, adjustments, expectations, waterfall versus agile. How do you reconcile? Yeah, how do you reconcile all of that?
So I don't have a ton of personal experience with hardware, but I do know that that is a more waterfall world just by definition. And so I think that it's probably, the advice is probably slightly less aggressively towards being flexible, but in general still applies. You should still be doing testing and iteration. You should still be validating the business case. And so with any of these, I think that there are different extremes to which you can go with different companies. And in general, I think B2B companies can go less to the extreme than consumer companies with a lot of this rapid change stuff. But that doesn't mean that we should abandon it altogether. Awesome. Thank you so much.